This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and even analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Welcome back, everyone. It's been very busy lately. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday. Right before Christmas hit, Nikon sent me a couple things that I'm going to be sharing with you guys over the next couple weeks. We got a Z7 II and a couple lenses. This one is the 14 to 24 millimeter f2.8, and the lens we're going to be talking about today is the NIKKOR Z 50 millimeter f1.2s, which is not compact, as you can see. So I'm looking forward over the next coming weeks, as this blocks my key light, to reviewing all of these for you. But in this video, we are going to be talking about the 50 millimeter f1.2. I've been shooting with this for a few days now. This is kind of an initial impressions. I'm very impressed so far with this lens. It is outstanding. As I mentioned, this lens is pretty big. There is a lot of glass in here, and I want to talk about why it was designed this way. I feel like in many ways this was a statement lens for Nikon. Last year, they announced the Noct, the 58mm f0.95 lens, which I was able to use last January. It's hard to believe that was earlier this year, right kind of before COVID hit. I was in New York City. I got to use that lens. I loved it. I thought the 58mm Noct was amazing. It is a razor-thin depth of field. It is a beast of a lens. It is heavy. It is massive. The depth of field is just razor-thin when you're shooting wide open, and you do miss a lot of shots because there's no autofocus, and you've got to do a lot of weird pre-focusing, but when you do get it to connect, the results are fantastic. I feel like that lens took a lot of heat from Nikon, mainly due to the fact of, one, its price, and two, the fact it was not an autofocus lens. So I think that's why we now have the 50mm f1.2, which in many ways, like the Noct, it's a lot of glass. It's pretty big. It's not nearly as big. It's also heavy, not nearly as heavy, but this is a more practical lens to use for day-to-day use. It's an f1.2 lens, and if you're into the really shallow depth of field, this is going to excel at medium distance shots, much like the Noct did. Even though it's not quite as razor thin a depth of field, it's still very thin, and it does extraordinarily well when shooting wide open if you want to isolate a subject this way. It also looks really good stop down, and it's got a lot of resolution. And of course, we do have autofocus, and this works really well. It's super fast when you pair it up with a Z6 II or a Z7 II. Now, what's interesting is Nikon are still using stepping motors in this lens design, but they've made a change to make it more efficient and theoretically quieter. And so instead of having one element group that moves to achieve the focus, they've done it with two. So the idea is that each element group has less distance to move. It's going to be more efficient, and it's going to be faster and quieter. I will say it is much faster. In terms of being quiet, Nikon are saying on their website that it's near silent, and I wouldn't go that far. However, I think this is an excellent lens to use in video applications. The motors in the autofocus are fairly silent, so it depends on what you're doing, where your mic placement is, how you have it set up. If you're vlogging, that could be one thing, but if you're using a mic that's off camera, you're probably not going to pick up much noise. It is pretty quiet. And the other cool use for video is with this lens, there is impressively almost no focus breathing. So focus breathing occurs when you go from both the extreme distances of the closest focus to infinity, and you actually see the field of coverage change, and that's what we refer to as breathing. And so if you're doing a pull focus and you're going back and forth, you're going to notice a lot of that, and this lens has almost none. So it's an excellent lens to use for video, and the image quality is just outstanding. The physical layout on this lens gives us a lot of options. We have the large focus collar. We also have a display where you can toggle back and forth depending on what you want to see. So if you want to see distance, if you want to see f-stop, if you're in a situation where you're maybe doing a studio shoot and you're not exactly using the viewfinder, this is a good way just to check your f-stop or your focus distance. It comes in fairly handy. We also have a custom function button on the left-hand side of the lens, as well as the autofocus versus manual focus switch. Of course, as with all Nikon lenses, this is kind of part-time autofocus. In other words, if you're in autofocus and you want to make an adjustment, just twist the collar and you can make that adjustment on the fly. And we also have a custom collar function ring. So this can be set up in your menus for various things. You can use this for exposure compensation. It's actually kind of nice to have. This lens features no less than 17 elements in 15 groups. This is a lot of glass. And this is why I was drawing that comparison with the Noct lens earlier. And I want to talk about why there's a lot of glass in here to achieve the look that it gets. We have 9 curved aperture blades, and as I mentioned, this lens is rather large. It uses 82mm filter threading size and comes in at 2.4 pounds or 1,090 grams. Close focus on this lens is really impressive at 1.5 feet or about 45 centimeters. This is going to give you the impression of an even shallower depth of field at really close distances. And like I said, the strength of a 1.2 lens is going to be those medium distance shot isolation, which does remarkably incredibly well. Let's talk about why there's so many elements in this lens and why it's as big as it is. So typically with modern lens design, with a premier lens like this, you are designing a lens that is pretty much going to have no imperfections in terms of image quality. All the aberrations will be compensated for, and that usually requires a lot of glass elements and a lot of technology to do. We are at an interesting time right now in the history of photography where we have the technology not only to make lenses like this, but also mass manufacture them and actually be able to sell them, keep the consistency level high. And that's what you're seeing with a lot of these lenses. We saw this, I guess, 2 years ago now with the Panasonic f1.4S lens, which is an incredible 50mm lens. And of course, a little bit later, we saw it with Canon with the RF 50mm f1.2. And now this comes over to the Nikon Z mount with the 50mm f1.2. So that's what we're looking at. So how well does it do? Well, if we look at some images, I want to show you a few things. So with this image, and I showed it to you a second ago, where we have our subject isolation, this is shot pretty much directly into the sun. I had a hard time getting this lens to actually flare. Now you can get just a little bit, and this is an example where you see a little bit of ghosting. You actually have to try to get it to flare, and I thought that was very impressive. So that flare resistance is very well controlled in this lens. Now, this is an extreme example, and we do see just a little bit of green fringing, and I did get a little bit of purple fringing to pop in one section on here. This is not normal shooting. We're shooting into the sun, so this is an extreme case. It's kind of a stress test that I was actually trying to do to get it to show up, and it really is impressively controlled. The fact that there's that little in a scene like this is pretty fantastic. And another thing about lenses design really in the last 15 years or so is that they perform really well wide open. If you've ever shot the old manual focus Nikon lenses from the 60s and the 70s, everyone knew back then that they were designed to go to f1.2, not necessarily because you're going to shoot it at f1.2, but the idea that wide open, that's where the lens is at its weakest. When you start to stop down, that's when things starting to tighten up. These lenses are kind of designed to be rocked wide open, and they do really well. Of course, the same principle does apply, that your depth of field gets much wider, and then you also get more sharpness and more detail. And when you start stopping down, the detail comes out. And what's really cool about this lens is we get sun stars really easily. They start at f5.6 on this lens, and of course they get bigger the closer you move to f16, but it also stops down and looks great too. And I want to talk a little bit about resolution, because that's a very important part of this system. We have the Z7 now. Who knows what they're going to do in the future in terms of even higher resolutions in cameras. So we want to future-proof lenses, talk about resolution a little bit. It's very important. I want to get into that. But first, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor today, who are the awesome folks over at Squarespace.com. Squarespace is the easiest way to build a photography website and earn money while doing it. So start with one of their award-winning templates and build your site. You can drag and drop images to build beautiful galleries, so there's no code to write and no server to manage. Squarespace also have tools to make your website work for you. They now have member-only areas for managing an audience and communicating directly, complete with audience insights. Make money with their advanced e-commerce tools for merchandising, inventory management, secure payments, and you can also extend e-commerce with Squarespace extensions. These are third-party tools that let you manage inventory, bookkeeping, filing sales tax, and even shipping items across the globe. You can take your photography and turn it into a business that works for you. So head over to squarespace.com and sign up for the free trial. When you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/AOP and save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Once again, that is squarespace.com/AOP. And I want to give a special shout out and thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. So one of the things that I cover in all of my Lens Days videos, especially when we're talking about lenses, is field curvature. Field curvature refers to that field of focus. We assume that that is straight, and a lot of times it actually has a curve or a lean to it, and there's various reasons why. So I have a little test for that. If we take an image of something with texture in it, in this case it's the street, and I run this into Photoshop through the Find Edges filter, this will give us an idea of what is in focus, and we can see if there's any curvature to this. And as you can see, there is none. This is perfectly straight. This is a very well balanced lens, and it does not have any field curvature at all. So if you're shooting architecture or people in a straight line, you can go for a really shallow depth of field and pretty much rest assured that anything in that plane of focus will be in focus, which is really nice. Now I want to look at Mtf charts as well. well. Now, MTF charts tend to get really mathematical, but they do tell us some things about the lens. I don't like to dwell on them, but they are worth looking at. In terms of MTF charts, what we are measuring is resolution. And so obviously the line on the left represents the center of the lens. As it moves towards the right, we go towards the corner. Now, every lens has a circle of projection. In other words, if you just took a lens and projected onto that back wall and shut the lights out, put a light through it, you would see it fade out as it goes towards the corners. And a lot of that has to do with how much light is being retained as it goes to the corners, and it also has to do with sharpness. So typically we do see MTF charts start to fade off as it goes to the corners. This one stays remarkably high. There's not a lot of crossing. That's because we don't have a lot of chromatic aberration. There is one cross here, and maybe that's why we're getting some of that. But this resolves extremely high at two different sets of line pairs. The top one is 10 line pairs per millimeter. The bottom one is 40. Now, you can see these are really high, but what does this mean in terms of resolution? Well, what this means is that when you clinically use a test chart, and these tests are made for MTF charts, they're actually measuring the contrast and the sharpness when you start putting a lot of lines together like that. And so this is going to give us basically an idea of detail. And this is fun to do with any lens. So if you take a picture of something, let's say right now it's fall, it's actually beyond fall here, all the leaves have fallen out of the trees, and you can see that there is a lot of sharpness. So if you think of the sticks in these trees as line pairs, and you actually look at the detail in here, I'm going to zoom in. This was shot on the Z7, so it's got more resolution to it, and you can see that the resolution is extremely good. Everything is very sharp, and having a high resolution really matters when you're shooting anything with texture or detail in it, and this lens really does hold up. One of my favorite parts is if we actually go over here, and this is sort of in the corner too, we retain the color detail of where the sun's hitting the sticks in the background but not the foreground, and it's just really beautiful. I love how this lens renders. This is a home run for Nikon, no question. This shot was done at f5.6. Of course, we probably could increase the depth of field and maybe get the moon a little sharper and the foreground a little sharper if I went to f16, but I kind of wanted to see where it did in the middle of the range. Clearly, this lens has a lot of upside. Are there any downsides to it? Well, this is going to come probably down to personal preference. I have read people kind of complain about the pricing on this lens, which I actually disagree with. This lens comes in at $2,096, I think. It's just under $2,100 US. That is a lot of money. I completely understand, but when you look at what went into this lens and you look at how much glass is in this lens and the technology that is inside, I think that it compares really well, and it's actually the cheapest of the three. I mentioned the Panasonic f1.4 and then also the Canon RF mount 50mm f1.2. This is actually the cheapest of the three lenses, and I think the price is about what you would expect for a premier lens like this. I do think that one point of contention with some photographers is going to be the size and the weight. Let me give you an example. For instance, this is a 50mm f1.2 lens from Nikon, and so is this. So there is a huge size difference, and this actually brings me to an interesting point. I would like to do a comparison video. If you guys have any questions, I want you to drop them below, because what I want to do is compare a couple, just keep them all Nikkor lenses. Like, we can look at the 50mm f1.2, which is an older design. This is not an old lens. They still make it today. It's a much less expensive lens, but it's still an f2. So there's a huge difference between these two. So what are we looking at in terms of price difference, and what are we looking at in terms of size difference, and what are the advantages and what do they give you? I would love to do some side-by-side shots. I think that would be really cool to do. I wanted to talk about this lens a lot more. I feel like I've had it for a very short amount of time. I was really excited. I wanted to share it with you guys, and I want to get some more sample shots and some more test images. So like I said, any questions, please put them below. I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.